Hi listeners, I'm Izzy, my pronouns are they and them. Welcome to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. This is Joella.
Before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the country that we're recording this episode on today and pay our respects to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples and their elders, past, present and emerging, by committing to always remembering that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Welcome everyone to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. My name is Jean Carruthers. My pronouns are she, her. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm currently on, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also recognise this land was never ceded. I wanted to acknowledge our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners, and especially as the topic today is focused on queer theory and pedagogy, I would like to also recognise particularly our brother boy and sister girl listeners. So this podcast explores critical and creative pedagogies used in social work practice and education. Today, we'll be unpacking Jen Kagan's interview with Angela about queer pedagogy. And I'm really happy to be here today with one of our podcast crew members, Izzy, and also a former QUT student, Peter. Really good to have you both here. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, good. So could you tell everyone, I might go to you, Peter, is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, could you tell everyone just a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this conversation?
So my name's Peter. I graduated my social work degree in 2020 in December. Yay, thankfully. My interest in this podcast, I guess, is just to get that a little more understanding, like from Jen's podcast and also from you guys, and also just to unpack that and reflect on what Jen said, and how that mixes with education and university. Yeah.
Absolutely. And practice.
yes.
Because you're in practice now.
I am in practice now.
Yes.
So I am a customer care and advocate at Connect Plan Management, which is a NDIS plan management organisation.
Yep.
I have quite a few clients who identify in the LGBTQIA plus family, which is awesome. So that, using things like queer theory and different lenses like feminism does come across in my practice,
Yeah. And you've also done some other stuff, haven't you, in relation to sort of using queer understanding or queer pedagogy potentially in some of the practice you did here.
Yes. So I was working at QUT, at International Student Services, and a part of my placement, I did my placement there, I did a research project into the need for a service for LGBTQIA plus international students who needed some form of support service. So we did all the research and found that it was actually something very crucially needed at the university. Nothing existed. So we started our little group Bliss with 5 international students, and then we grew to, I think it was about 65 in a few months.
Yep.
So,
How exciting.
It was
so from
awesome.
How many?
From 5 to about 65
wow.
in a few months,
Wow.
Yeah.
That's huge.
It was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was honoured enough to win a VC award for that as well. So,
congratulations.
That was pretty cool.
Yep. Yeah. Fabulous.
Yeah.
And what about you, Izzy? Can you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and what's brought you to this conversation?
Yeah, okay. So I'm Izzy. My pronouns are they, them, and I am one of the crew members making this podcast. So that is part of why I'm here. But I am also a queer person myself, and so I'm very interested in queer pedagogies. I did my first placement working with transgender young people, and so queer theory and queer pedagogies have significantly been a part of that practice. And I have always wanted to work with queer people in my practice. So I think that this is a good conversation to be having. Yeah. I'm super passionate about social work education and how we can queer social work education. So yes. I really loved Jen's podcast because it really took a deep dive into some of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And just following on from that, so for me, where queer theory comes into my practice is the ways that I do have the intention to bring queer ideas and recognition of the ways we need to challenge ideas and discourses around heteronormativity, also recognising the ways that often people from queer communities are not represented in our case scenarios, which is something that Jen was talking about. And so reconciling those kinds of things in my own practice. And so being really aware as a cisgender woman, but also someone who has queer theory as part of my practice, it's really important that I'm bringing that so that it does recognise the important things that are part of our practice, because we are all, as social work and human services workers, going to be working in areas where we need to have queer theory to back. We are going to be in areas where people are exposed to homophobic assumptions and those sorts of things, and we're going to work with people who are queer.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
No way around that. Yeah.
No way around that. No. Did either of you want to speak to any of that from Jen's?
I just think it's really super awesome to kind of see you doing that as well, because you especially are kind of helping mentor and bring through the next generation of social workers. And so I think it's really wonderful to kind of know that they are going to be aware of things like heteronormativity and how it's shaped our assumptions. And yeah, it's really good to kind of see that starting to happen in social work education.
Yeah, and I get to learn from Jen. So I get to have Jen as a mentor that I get to work alongside and things like that. What about for you? What stood out for you?
I think these students now are so lucky and so privileged to have this form of education here at QUT, because when I was doing my degree, really heteronormativity. What was that? What was queer theory? No.
Yeah.
The only time that was ever spoken about was when I was in class with Jen, and you know, nothing was ever taken on from that. There was no, you know, sexuality or diversity or gender classes within the social work, and I really think that's something that needs to change.
Yeah.
Because like we said before, it doesn't matter what area of social work or human services you are working in, you're practicing in, you will come across gay people, lesbians, transgender people, bisexual people. So, you know, and gender diverse people. There's no way around that.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
The more knowledge you have and the more ability you have to use these theories and that critical reflection and critical thinking, the better off you're going to be in your practice for those people.
Yeah. And it's not easy.
No.
Like I know Jen was even saying that this is really, really important because of the harm that can be caused when there is not an awareness of these things, especially because we have a growing student cohort of queer students, and I think it's amazing to see that grow. We do have support as educators from our equity program, and we do have ally training, which is fantastic, that we have access to those things. However, Jen also mentions that, you know, we have Queer Week, you know, where we talk about queer theory in a class in a particular week, and we might have particular case scenarios that are related to queer theory, and sometimes like that can be problematized. So it's about being aware of not problematizing the ways that we represent identities like LGBTIQA plus identities and the ways that we use language, and knowing that that's hard as well. So knowing that that's, and it shouldn't be, but it is because of our conditioning.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that idea of just having a queer week really totally forgets about intersectionality, whereas actually we should be thinking about the way that queer identities intersect with so many other things that, we actually need to be thinking about this all semester rather than just for 1 week isolated from anything else.
Yeah, for sure.
Intersectionality played a huge part in the Bliss group with me because of that huge diversity of people's religions and cultures, backgrounds. It was just amazing, from Muslim backgrounds, from Christian, it was really a blessing to have knowledge about intersectionality and how queer theory and that just go together so well, and explain that it's just more than sexuality or gender. It's also those other things that So that was
and
good.
Especially for students who are international, and so they're here, they're on their own, they don't have their families to support and things like that.
I actually had a lot of students that were actually finding it very hard to come to terms with the fact that it's okay in Australia. You know what I mean? Like we now have that privilege of, marriage and things like that. The policies and laws around are a lot better than places like, Sri Lanka or, some places in Africa where, you can be put to death for these things or put into jail for the rest of your life. And these students found it very hard that it's okay. And it's okay to be yourself and to express love for someone of the same sex or, to explore those different aspects of their sexuality and gender.
For sure.
So, yeah.
And you were talking about how these things are internalised as well. You spoke a little bit about your background in relation to...
Homophobia, internalized homophobia, was something that I battled with for quite some time. During my early teens, I didn't actually come out to my family or friends until I was 22 years old. I grew up in a small coal mining town, population of 4,000 people. That toxic masculinity and, that reign of patriarchy in a town like that, full of men, being the only person that I knew of who was having these strange feelings and, what's wrong with me and blah, blah, blah. And then you can come back to that language thing as well of what languages you were, used to describe gay people in a place like Dysart, which I'm not going to repeat because they're quite vulgar, really made me not want to be gay, not want to be me. So I hid that for quite some time. And it's taken a long time to deal with that. But now I'm proud of who I am. I don't see my sexuality as a huge part of myself, but it is still a part of me and I'm still proud to be me. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and you've got that heteronormativity also creates what we call comphet. So that's compulsive heterosexuality. So it's an experience that I think I've noticed a lot of young people struggle with it quite a bit, and it's the idea that everyone is heterosexual and therefore you probably are too. And so you'll see a lot of teenage girls who later realize they're lesbians, who feel like they have to date boys because that's what everybody's doing, and they haven't yet figured themselves out, but they also don't sort of even comprehend that that there is anything else. They just sort of we're teaching people that this is how you should be, and therefore no one's thinking to question their identities necessarily, and potentially that sort of leads to a lot of rough times and mental illness and sort of a lot of stresses as well. And obviously there is the internalized homophobia too.
And so speaking of heteronormativity, because we've mentioned that word a few times, but we haven't really unpacked it. I've got a definition here, but I'd also like to hear from you guys about what that means to you, like what that represents in your circumstances or your lives or your education, for example. So heteronormativity is a process that refers to the institutions, social structures and dominant knowledge that privilege heterosexuality as the most intelligible, isn't that an interesting word? The most intelligible form of sexual expression produced in almost every aspect of social and cultural life, often to the point of being invisible. So that idea that we have that binary of men and women as the only way to represent sexuality, and that is the conditioning of our society or the dominance of our society. So heterosexuality or heteronormativity is the ways that that's normalised.
Yeah.
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 So how would you describe it?
Well, like my era, like growing up, because I'm really old, very different to what
I think I'm older than you, Peter.
Hopefully. I think compared to your generation, extremely different on that, I would say. Like that's all we saw. I never saw two men together or two women together. I didn't know what gay was. I had no clue whatsoever until I think I was about 14. I had experienced, strange feelings, but I actually saw something on TV, and that was the Mardi Gras. I saw the parade, and that was like, it was like, what's going on? And, having that conversation with a friend who I knew I could be open and honest with and safe with. And she was like, yeah, that's this and that. And I'm like, wow, it was mind blowing to me at that age. So yeah, that's what I grew up with, man, woman. That's what heteronormativity is to me. And back then I never knew the word for it. And until I started uni, it was, a non-existent word for me. So,
See, I think that's very different to my experience, where obviously I still experience heteronormativity. It's still everywhere. But I was really lucky, partly because it is a different time, partly because my parents were quite progressive. But I grew up in a home where there were lesbians in our house pretty regularly. My mum, one of my mum's closest friends, is a lesbian. So she was always coming over with her girlfriend. And so I kind of got to see that a little bit. But even still, that was very outside the standard, right?
Yes.
The idea of, in my head, what was normal and what was expected was still very much man and a woman, and they'll probably grow up and they'll have kids and they'll live in, a house with a white picket fence and
all those stages.
Yeah, they'll probably have a dog and it's still, and I think that hurts straight people as well, a lot of those expectations around that. And I think that comes back to some of that feminist lens as well, of analysing the patriarchy and the way they've set up the way a family is supposed to look. But I think that while I was really lucky to have experiences of queer people even as a kid, the idea that straight was still the standard was very much entrenched in my life.
Yeah. As I got older, there was my cousin's mate that was gay, but he was, the way that my auntie and uncle and my grandparents would describe him was, oh, he's so lonely, and look at him, he's he's depressed and he's sad because he doesn't have anyone, and he shouldn't be like that. If he was straight, then he would be able to get married and have kids. And so that was another thing for me that really wanted me to not be like that. Because I wanted those things. So,
and even for me, like, there was this, I think when I was starting to figure out who I was, there was this idea that lesbians are like that, and I'm not like that. I have long hair, so I can't be a lesbian.
Long hair.
Not
Yes.
anymore, I don't, but until a couple of years ago, I'd always had really long hair, and I was always
But
quite...
lesbians don't have
But
long
lesbians
hair.
don't have long hair. Lesbians have short hair. Lesbians are pretty butch and masculine. And I think that a lot of those stereotypes are coming from heteronormativity as well, and a way to other lesbians and make assumptions about people. I think there, for a long time I watched, you'd see people make assumptions about others, especially at school, in high school. If a woman looked masculine, she was obviously a lesbian. And if a boy was too feminine, he's gay. Yeah. And that was a bad thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's not even the assumption that is the way it is. It's the connotation that's behind the assumption that's denigrating in that respect. I'm very conscious of in my own life we have a bit of a legacy where my husband's uncle was one of the first people that started Mardi Gras.
Oh wow.
So Uncle Philip. Hi, Uncle Philip. And he actually said, and Izzy and I were having this conversation earlier, he said when he started, so he's in the history books, but he said it was when the lesbians came, that's when it became a big thing. So the diversity grew from there. And now we think of Mardi Gras and we think of such intersectionality, such diversity of identity and all of those kinds of things. And it's really representative of some pretty amazing stuff and changes that have happened. Absolutely. However, it's taken a really long time and we've still got a long way to go, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of heteronormativity, some of the conditioning in my own life being a cisgendered woman and the ways that I have strong intentions to support especially my queer students, you know, and wanting to be able to recognise my own assumptions that I make and my own homophobia, you know, because that conditioning is so strong. And even we talk about pronouns and using pronouns, and we talk about the ways that we'll be speaking about someone and automatically use the wrong pronouns. And it's so easy to do, and it's so hard to shift that conditioning, but it's about not giving up. It's about continuing to work with that, and it's about also recognising when you've messed it up. You know, recognising and correcting and continuing to do those things. And I feel it inside. And I know I've done that in a situation where it was a really public place, and I know that person felt it immediately because I could see the difference. And even though I corrected, I was very mindful of the ways that I didn't, in that public forum, make a massive deal of it. So I call it homonormative fragility, you know, where it becomes all about you and you're, I'm so sorry, please, I'll make it up.
It's so hard.
If I was to do that in that public space, that person would be incredibly embarrassed. However, in a private conversation, we were able to have that conversation, and I was able to say to that person, look, I'm really sorry. I know that you felt that. And in that conversation, the person kind of said, well, this feels good to have this conversation, you know. And so being able to have those conversations and not making it about us, especially when we mess it up, knowing that if that happens, it's something that we can continue to work towards, and something that we can continue to and I say normalise, but you wouldn't, because when we talk about queer theory, we're disrupting the normal. So it's not about normalising, it's about shifting it. So when we talk about queer theory and we talk about disrupting, tell me how you interpret that.
Lord.
With the normal.
Not normal. I really can't stand the word normal, to be honest. Yeah. As far as I'm concerned, it should be taken from the dictionary and any other language. I would refer to that as boring. Yeah. Because to me, that's what is normal. You cannot put a definition on normal.
No.
There's no, what's in the dictionary, that's not normal. You know what I mean? Like what's your basis from that? What's your example of normality?
Yeah.
What is it? You know what I mean?
I know.
Yeah.
I can't answer that question, Peter.
I know. You do. Your normal is your normal.
Yes.
My normal is, being with the man, being in love with a man, going and having coffee. That's my normal. That's, being passionate about human rights and gay and lesbian rights and every other rights you could possibly imagine. That's my normal.
So our subjectivity is different. Like we come with our identity, and that sort of our whole subjectivity is part of those things, and it might be normal to us.
Yeah.
Are you saying you're boring?
But for other people, yes, I have been called boring. Don't you worry about that. I've been called boring and domestic, which I find amazing. I love nothing more than being a domestic goddess,
Yes, of course.
I had to apologise to my girlfriend the other night because I got really excited that we were cooking dinner together. Because I thought that was so much, I had so much fun.
Apologise.
And we were chopping things together and boogieing around the kitchen and it was I apologised for being too domestic. And she was like, no, this is adorable. I love it. And it's like, well, yeah. There's nothing wrong with being domestic.
Definitely not. And being a chef and a florist, my house is amazing.
Yes.
That's not stereotyping or anything, is it?
I love it. So we know that queer theory is a disruptor. It's a disruptor of normal. We know that pronouns are important to people. Did you want to speak to that a bit?
And I think just going back to sort of your experience talking about as an educator with a student, I think it's also really important because you are in a position of power to be correcting other people when they're misgendering students, especially queer student, not correcting queer students, but if another student is misgendering a queer student, I think it's really important that you sort of use your power in the right way there to sort of affirm the student's gender and make sure, because plenty of students don't misgender someone intentionally or harmfully, but they don't realise what they've done because I think especially while we're still figuring out how to be good critical social workers, we don't necessarily think about some of those things, especially in early lectures and things like that. So I think that as a lecturer, you being able to stand up and correct people is really important. Not to embarrass anybody, but to make people think about what they're saying and how that is rooted in some of those norms.
Absolutely. And I think not just misgendering, it's other things as well. So if we're talking about construction that is related to a queer identity, if we're talking about a case scenario that's related to a situation where somebody who is trans is the person in that particular case scenario, and we're exploring that in an educational process, it's really important that there's going to be conversations that are had while people are learning that their language might not be right, and they're trying to say things in a particular way, but it's not coming out the way that they're anticipating that it's saying.
And also, I think those brave spaces can be really helpful with that because it allows us to feel comfortable saying things and feel comfortable being challenged so that we can learn and correct our language and sort of,
But what would make it safe enough to be brave?
I think having a good facilitator helps with that a lot. And so speaking from my experience and going back a bit to the importance of pronouns. So pronouns are, for one, very affirming. But for me, if a lecturer like yourself, Jean, introduces themselves with their pronouns or is wearing a little pronoun badge or whatever, for me, that says that you're someone who at least has some level of awareness, right? If something happens, you're probably going to back me up and be at least some level of aware of sort of queer experiences and why pronouns matter, because no one's going to be wearing a pronoun badge or introducing themselves if they don't know that pronouns do matter. And so that, I think, while it seems like a small thing, it can be a thing that really sort of can make someone more comfortable. and show us that, you will have their back, and that is a safe space to be queer in, almost, if that makes sense, and just be who you are.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Pronouns, I myself don't use. I fully understand how they have helped support people in the community. However, like I said before, I don't box myself. I've never pigeonholed myself. And like I said, my sexuality is a little tiny piece of me. I want to be known for me, not my sexuality. So but I fully understand how that is really awesome that people do. And I mean, if I was, doing the sessions with the international students, I used to use my pronouns to get them, trying to, follow on but in those types of situations, I think it's needed, but I don't use them every day. Well,
and while you don't use them for yourself, you're still respectful of them for other people and everything.
Yeah.
And so I think that, for you, that's a choice for yourself, and an absolutely wonderful one. But also, you're still respectful of other people.
Exactly.
Which is,
I actually watched comedy thing last night on Netflix. It's the gay, all of the people in there were gay. It was fantastic. And Wanda Sykes, whom I love, she is amazing. An advocate, a fierce advocate. And one of her bits was actually talking about pronouns. And she said, my twins were having a conversation, and my son asked about this person in the class and used she.
Yeah.
And my daughter was like, no, wait up. It's they. They, their pronouns are they, them. And he's like, okay, cool. And there was no rebuttal, no anything. And she then said, so if you're a person who's whinging about pronouns and people using their pronouns and having to use pronouns to make other people feel comfortable and respected, all you are is fucking old. I think it's so true. And narrow-minded.
Yeah.
And just stuck in your way. There's no evolution happening up here or in here, because that's where this stuff comes from. It comes from the heart, not,
And I think for some people, saying their pronouns is more exposing than other people. Like, I can say my pronouns and I'm part of the dominant group.
Yeah.
Like, if I say she, her, and I'm a cisgender woman, it's a lot safer for me to say my pronouns without being discriminated against. And I know that there have been students on placement who have said their pronouns, and then the way that they've been treated has changed. And things like that. So it's really tough in relation to those kinds of things. And not to say that was from everybody in that placement. It was actually a very tricky situation at the time, but it made that person have to perform something different to what they were. And so Judith Butler talks about the ways that we perform gender. And I know that there's a student colleague that I've had conversations with in the past who they would say that we can't necessarily perform our authentic self in any given situation. Like, we can perform parts of ourselves until we know it's safe to perform more of ourselves. So it really challenges or disrupts that idea of the authentic self and what that authentic self is when you are constantly performing different things. I know in my own situation, I perform, when I'm performing a lecture, I perform differently to when I perform in a tutorial. It's a different role. However, I can choose how I perform without being discriminated against.
Yeah. Sometimes I think for myself and for a lot of trans people I know, performing differently isn't a choice. It's you either do this and you stay safe, or you don't perform and you're putting yourself at risk.
Yes, absolutely. And that whole idea of a performance and not knowing what the outcome will be of that performance is really tricky.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in kind of public spaces, or if you're going into, like you mentioned, someone going on to prac, if you're going into a new space, you have no idea how people are going to potentially perceive things or react to things, and that can be scary.
And this person actually said to me, it's so nice when they don't have to educate other people.
I actually like educating other people. I think it's, especially if those people want to engage in
The conversation.
gaining that knowledge.
Yep.
I'm an extremely open person. I'm the one to have the conversation. You can ask me whatever you want to ask me. I'm an open book. Go for it. Just as long as you're ready for the answer.
I'm always happy to educate people as well and talk about my experiences. At the same time, one of the things I loved about my last prac was that everyone was already well informed. I didn't have to do anything. I could just be who I was and present however I wanted to, and everyone still called me the right name and referred to me by the right pronouns, and I could just kind of relax and focus on my education and my prac experience rather than constantly having to think about how to behave or who I would have to educate next or anything like that. So while it's great that you're willing to teach people, sometimes it's so nice not to have to.
Yeah.
Thank you. So there's a couple of things that I want to, we are coming to a close. We've been given the sign.
Been cut off. Haley.
So there's a couple of things I wanted to sort of close off with. And one of those things is around us being able to, like when we're thinking about our practice, when we're thinking about ourselves as students, how we're learning these things, is to start thinking queerly. So which Jen would say would be thinking deeply about the normative assumptions that we might have and the binary constructions that we create around male and female, and sort of expanding on those ideas and recognizing, I call it all the slashes, postmodernism is all the slashes. Right. Queer theory takes it to the idea of an acronym, but I also think even with the acronym, we need to know what those words mean and what they represent within that acronym, because they're people.
Yeah.
It's not an acronym, it's people within that context or that construct. The use of terms like diverse genders and sexualities is a way that you can say things without using the acronym if you feel like you can't do that confidently.
Yeah.
Because I know it can be like if someone kind of says, LGBTQIA.
What was that?
What was that? It doesn't matter. That's really dismissing of what that acronym actually means. And so thinking deeply about the ways we sort of challenge those assumptions and really consider thoughtfully the ways that we use our language. My thoughts on queer thinking is simply similar to my ideas around post-structuralism. I've just said that, all the slashes. So important to acknowledge those acronyms are attached to people. The other thing is post-queer thinking. Okay, so disrupting normativity in areas beyond gender and sexuality. And an example that I give, so queer theory came from reclaiming the word queer, which was a really denigrating word. And it was like, you're going to call us it, we're going to claim it, and we're going to turn it on its head, and make it something that's empowering. And so I was doing some work with an organisation that works with people from refugee backgrounds, and we were doing this online campaign, and we reclaimed the boats. Yeah. And so we did a thing where everyone put boats with a message on it to people from refugee backgrounds about welcoming them to here, and that was an online thing that we all made a boat and put it online. And so that reclaiming of something, also disrupting that normativity in areas beyond gender and sexuality and things like that, not to take it away from the ideas that are really important around challenging heteronormative assumptions, challenging the binary constructions of gender, but recognising that queer theory can be used beyond that. Identifying...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Did you want to say something to that?
No, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. So identifying fluidity of identity alongside intersectionality. So the identity and the ideas of intersectionalities of oppression and privilege sit beside each other. So it's sort of moving beyond we're just an identity or we're just an oppressed person, and recognising that those things interact with each other. Damien Riggs has a podcast on intersectionality in social work. And there's a really good episode. He's had a guest, Sally O'Sullivan and Ari Levy, and also other people that really speak to that complexity, because their identity, their ethnicity, their race, non-binary identification and so on are all part of their experience, but also the really tough stuff in their lives that they've had to deal with, like the loss of a child and being a grieving parent and those sorts of things. They're really powerful messages that they send. So that's one to have a look at as well. Thank you both. It's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation. And was there any final comments that you wanted to say before we leave? No?
Can I redo my bachelor? So we
Absolutely.
can get in on this.
We would be very happy to have you.
Yay! I'll come and do a guest lecture. No.
Thank you both. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you to our listeners, and bye for now.
Bye.
Thanks.
If you'd like to keep up with any of our socials and to continue listening to future episodes, please follow us on Instagram. That's Critical Conversations, the number 4 SW.